Welcome everyone. My name is Stephanie. I work at Move United, and thank you for joining us today, and to everyone who has tuned in for our entire series. Today we are focusing on measuring and ordering racing wheelchairs. We're delighted to have Daniel Romanchuk and Kriege Skavort with us today, as well as Paul Schulte and Eric Fife. He's over there with Paul. Paul is an operations and engineering manager and design engineer at Invacare Top End and is a three-time wheelchair basketball Paralympian. Eric is a 2018 Paratriathlon national champ as well as an Army veteran. I would also like to highlight Daniel's mom, Kim, as she's been a big part of every session and is on with us again today. Just for everyone's knowledge, this session is going to be recorded for future use. You can find it on Move United's YouTube and Facebook pages, and attendees will be on mute to minimize any distractions, but please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A function at any time. We will try to get to them at the end. With that, I will turn it over to Paul to go ahead and get us started.
All right. Thank you, Stephanie. Can you hear me all right?
We can hear you.
Very good. All right. Well, yes, thank you for the intro. As she said, my name is Paul Schulte. Appreciate Eric joining me. I started, I got hurt when I was 10 and then got into Paralympic sport when I was a teenager. I got my engineering degree, and in 2006, I came to work at the Top End factory, and that's really where I really first started to gain more of my knowledge about racing chairs. Working very closely with Chris Peterson, and over time knowing Barry Ewing as well from Eagle, and had the opportunity to work with a number of elite athletes. Some I'm sure people know their names: Ernst Van Dyke, Kurt Fernley, Heinz Fry, and others that I've been able to work closely with on their chair designs, on their setups. And so I'm honored at the chance to be able to share the fundamentals and basics of what the racing chair cage measurements are, as well as some tips and tricks for the basics of how someone can begin to measure another person for their racing chair. So what I want to mention right off the bat is that really measuring someone for a racing chair it's both art and science at the same time. And so each racing chair really is a snowflake. It's custom built for the individual themselves and has to do with that person's body size and shape. It has to do with their disability, their classification, and as well as their personal preferences and their goals. And so I wanted to point out that when it comes to racing chairs, there are actually a few models made by Eagle as well as Top End that are adjustable. So I know Eagle sports chairs has a racing chair where the knee height is adjustable. And so whereas Top End has the pre-eliminator model that has adjustability to the seat and adjustability to the axle position, some things you can move around. So it's good to bear in mind for any program. I'm not aware that Carbon Bike has anything in terms of adjustability, but Eagle and Top End certainly do. So that's something to bear in mind for program chairs, because really everyone that gets started in an adaptive sport starts out with a hand-me-down product. They start out with someone's old chair. And so the best way to measure someone for a racing chair is to have them in a racing chair that fits reasonably well for them, at least close enough, functional, something functional that you can use to help measure the upper frame width, the lower frame width, and we'll go through some of that. So I wanted to share my screen real quick so I can talk to you about the three basic cage styles for eliminators that we make here at Top End. And these three basic cage styles are also consistent for some of the other manufacturers. So the fundamental cage styles that you have are three different types. You have a U cage, and bear with me just 1 second here. I think it's going to be annotate and spotlight. So hopefully now you can see my cursor lit up in red here a little bit. Okay, so basically over on the left we have the U cage. This is the one that we're going to be focusing on today. It's the kneeling style racing chair. And over on the right, you have the I cage style and the V cage style. So as soon as you're fitting an athlete for the first time, one of the fundamental questions you want to ask first is this person most suited for the kneeling position, or are they really better off when it comes to transfer and performance in the chair if they had their feet forward and they were not in a kneeling position, but in more of a traditional sitting position? Their feet, rather than being tucked in behind them, underneath in a kneeling position, their feet would be out in front, resting on a clamp-on footrest, for example. Typically, the I cage predominantly has been used for higher level injuries, where transferring in and out, higher level injuries, or even sometimes beginners, where transferring in and out is perhaps a significant barrier for them. And so the I cage represents the least amount of obstructions to someone being able to transfer in and get into the chair independently. V cages can be set up both for the feet forward position as well as a kneeling setup, but in general they're used a bit more for the feet forward position. And so we're going to focus on the eliminator, the eliminator U cage. So I'm going to just maximize this real quick. And I kind of wanted to start with the anatomy of the cage. And so when you're looking at a racing chair cage itself, most people are familiar with the fenders, the pieces that go and kind of protect the rider from the wheels and curve right along and hug the tire and wheel themselves. But besides the fenders, you also have the seat rails. So seat rails are what the upholstery slings across and what you'd actually sit on. There's also the U cross member in front. This is where the ever important knee width comes into play, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the U cross member, and those are three of the fundamental, as well as the camber tube, excuse me. So the rear axle, or also referred to as the camber tube. And those four, really, U cross member, camber tube, seat rails, and uprights, those combine to contribute to most of the dimensions that are important when you're fitting a racing chair. So that's some of the terminology we're going to use. And we're going to walk through the basic measurements that are key and important. So camber angle. So the camber angle, I think, was covered, touched on previously in a video produced by Move United. But camber angle essentially has to do with the angle of the wheels themselves. And so on a racing chair, let me get right over here, the camber angle is represented right here. So it's the amount that the wheels are going to slant outward. And I would say, by and large, just to get right to it, I think that most manufacturers will offer between 10 and 13, sometimes 15 degrees. By and large, I see the most 11 degree and 12 degree choices. I'd say most commonly, if you're not sure where to start, 12 degrees seems to be like a reasonable place to start, but I also see a lot of athletes using 11. So where that would make a difference and why you would choose one over the other is that even though while it's slight, as you increase the camber of the wheels, the distance between the fenders at the top is going to remain the upper frame width that we choose. So as you increase the camber, the outside edges of the fenders and the wheels go a little bit further outward. And so if you're looking for the most narrow package for pushing straight down on the wheels, lesser camber will have less material sticking out in the way of your push. But at the same time, you want to be stable around turns. So 12 degrees is a reasonable place to get started with any particular athlete. All right, so the upper frame width. So you heard me talk about this just a little bit. Upper frame width is measured directly above the center of the camber tube between the insides of the fenders. So this document is what we call a measurement definition document at the top end. And at the factory, we use it for a common language to be able to make sure we're referring and that we're teaching appropriately for a given measurement. So these documents are available to Move United, and I think they're going to be sharing them with participants. So you'll be able to see this again if you'd like. So upper frame width, as I said, is measured directly above the center of the camber tube between the insides of the fenders. So let me go right over to here to this diagram. So this is what that's talking about. So it's measured directly above the camber tube, kind of the shortest distance between the fenders. This can range for athletes. The smallest that I tend to see, I think the smallest I've ever seen was a 9, but as you can imagine, for someone's rib cage, that's quite small. So I see some 10s and 11s, but I feel like most frequently I'll see some, I'll see 12s, some 13s, but typically it seems to stay between 10 and 13 inches. for athletes most commonly. So that's what the upper frame width is. And my plan is to review these in person with Eric here just a little bit so we can demonstrate. Lower frame width is measured at the top of the seat rails and from the outsides of the uprights. From the top of the seat rails and the outside of the uprights. So basically, lower frame width is measured right here. These are the seat rails. And what you'd want to do is you wanted to measure the outsides of the uprights at the height of the top of the seat rails. So right there, you're basically looking for this magic spot right there and outside to outside. The upper frame width and the lower frame width correspond to someone's body in general as a rule of thumb. The upper frame width you want to pay real close attention to. Sorry, Eric, I'm just going to start moving around. You want to pay real close attention on the upper frame width to basically the lower rib cage of your athlete. The only mistake you can, I say the only mistake, one of the major mistakes you can make in a racing chair, they need to be actually physically able to get into the chair in the first place. And so one of the ways you can go wrong is to make it too narrow and the athlete doesn't fit. And so with upper frame width, we tend to key in on, the athlete's rib cage, outer width of the rib cage. You can accomplish and acquire that by either using a couple of books, ideally an actual racing chair, getting in and then kind of basically measuring the amount of extra distance you have and how much you might be able to tighten that up. And then the lower frame width, that's where we'll be looking more to Eric's hips and the distance outside to outside of his hips as he transfers into his chair. So again, upper frame width, you want to key in on that rib cage. Lower frame width, you want to pay more attention to the hips. And I think it's worth mentioning that, believe it or not, you will see everything as far as requests, but I would say by and large, you'd be able to find quite a few racing chairs that measure, let's say, a given width at the top, maybe 11 inches, and that there will be approximately a 2-inch difference from the top to the bottom. And so if you had somebody that measured 11 inches upper frame width, it's not always this way, but I will say that it's not uncommon that the lower frame width would end up measuring around 13 inches. So a difference of that amount is very, very common. You're not able to go more than a 3 or 3.5 inch difference. So if you had 13 and then you were trying to get a lower frame width of 14 or 15, typically a manufacturer will guide you toward what won't work. But as that lower part starts to grow out, it gets closer and closer to the wheels. And so there is a limit to what you can specify and what you can combine together with upper and lower frame width. And there are occasions where it's not just 2 inches different on the bottom, but an athlete actually needs it like this, where it's an inch or two wider on the top than the bottom, in certain cases where the rib cage is wider than the hips. All right, so that's a bit about upper and lower frame width. Rear seat height. Rear seat height is measured from the top of the seat rail to the ground at the front of the uprights. So what's it talking about there? That is, rear seat height is right here. So we're talking about the top of the seat rail just in front of the upright, measured directly down to the ground. Simple enough? Okay, the overall length. The overall length of the chair, simply put, is measured from the most outsides of the front and rear tires. So if I look at that overall length represented right here, so it's from the front. Basically, you can push the chair back up against a door or a flat surface and measure from the door to the front of the chair. Overall, when it comes to overall length, we'll talk about seat height again in a minute, but when it comes to overall length, I would say more often than not, on Eliminator OSRs, I see a 72-inch overall length chosen as a common size that seems to be useful for both track as well as road. And then on our Eliminator NRG, our elite racing chair, we see more 74s than we do 70-inch. So overall length, the only thing I can say concretely that I've seen as a pattern is that road athletes tend to like a longer overall length than a track athlete does. And also that in general, a larger person may tend toward a larger overall length, but really has to do with the rollability on the road versus on the track, your ability to carve the corner. So 72 and 74 very common, but for some smaller athletes, you may want smaller than that. Okay, axle position. So axle position is measured from the center of the camber tube to the front of the rear upright. Note, this measurement is taken parallel to the ground. So let's zoom in here. Axle position, and this is a key and important one because this axle position determines how much of your weight is in front of or behind the rear wheel. or in other words, how tippy your chair is. So axle position, as you can see, just like it said, we're measuring from the center of the camber tube to the front of the rear upright, measured parallel to the ground. For this one, it's typical to begin an athlete out. I know Adam Blakeney gave me advice years ago saying that when he's working with a new athlete, it's not uncommon for him to start at 6 inches for an axle position. The most I've seen from an athlete before, I think, was 8.5, but it's much more common on axle position for it to actually range between a very small amount, from 6 inches to 7.5 inches. In that ballpark, I've found to be very common for your average athlete as a rule of thumb. You do have adjustability in the back upholstery where you can loosen it and position an athlete further rearward. So there is a slight amount of adjustability there, but usually you want to have it down within a small range to begin with, and then you can count on a little bit of adjustability from there. Knee height is measured from the top of the U-cage crossmember, U-cage horizontal crossmember to the ground. So the knee height then, let's see if I can get a picture of it. That is, there it is. So here's our looking at the chair from the front, here's our U-cage crossmember, and the horizontal portion of it directly to the ground is the knee height. In general, so the rear seat height and the knee height work together to kind of figure out basically, in essence, how high the athlete's knees are going to be relative to their hips. In Eric's case, Eric uses a knee height of 18 inches and a rear seat height of 17 inches. This can vary by a lot. Typically, the higher level injury, the lower you'll see the rear seat height. And so it's not uncommon for us to see rear seat height requests of 16 inches, 15 inches, and in some custom cases, even lower than that. And then knee heights seem to range everywhere from as low as possible of a 15 and a half inch knee height all the way up to a 20. But again, it's not uncommon there to see a difference of 1 to 2 inches between the rear seat height and the knee height in front. When it comes to that knee height, what you want to bear in mind is that most athletes, most of us that are spinal cord injuries or spina bifida, the higher our knees go, the more that we tend to be able to gain from some of that tightening of the tendons in the back, on the back of the quads and up through your butt and your backside. But basically, as the knees come up, you're able to get a little bit more core stability, and then more importantly, positioning the knees is basically helping determine where your upper body is going to stop in the downstroke of your push. And so managing that for an athlete, you may get someone in a racing chair for the first time, and if their knees are really, really low, you'll see it in their eyes real quick. They're like, whoa, I feel like I'm gonna fall forward. I feel like I'm gonna fall out of it forward. And that may be a good opportunity to throw in a small cushion, raise the knees, experiment a little bit with what that knee height needs to be for that athlete. So that's what knee height is and how it relates to rear seat height. The knee depth is measured from the back of the rear upright to the front of the U-cage crossmember. This is also taken parallel to the ground. So knee depth here, the back of the rear upright, measured along parallel to the floor and to the front of the U crossmember. In general, this is typically a default measurement. I think on our order forms, it defaults at 18 inches, but it really has to do with the femur length of the athlete. You'll know there's kind of two extremes. It doesn't necessarily, doesn't directly impact performance as much as other dimensions do. But if you've got it going too long, then you can tell an athlete gets in the chair and their knees are significantly behind the U crossmember. Or the other extreme is that their knees are sticking so far out front that they're in some discomfort because where it's pressing on their leg is just further back than you want. So in general, athletes will have a little bit of the knees sticking out the front, but not a lot. That's a little bit about knee depth. Knee width, this one's a key one. So knee width is measured between the insides of the U-cage vertical tubing. So let's get back to that knee width right here. We were showing earlier. So the knee width of a racing chair is measured between the vertical portions of the U crossmember. In general, this stays within a range that we've experienced, I've experienced, anywhere between 7 to 10 inches. There are cases where you have an 11-inch or a 12-inch knee width for a larger individual that has a lot of soft tissue or is just a large person. But I think that anyone that's measured racing chairs has seen a lot of 8s a lot of 9s, a lot of 9.5s, and a fair number of 10s as well. So Eric, for example, is 6'1" and 185 pounds. And Eric just sitting here, if I bring his, if I back Eric up a little bit, bring the camera angle down, and I just start measuring the width of Eric's knees. Right now, it's about 8.5 inches when he's just sitting here. But what you want to bear in mind is that once we get Eric nice and folded up into his racing chair, that soft tissue is going to compress in a little bit, and just because his knees measure this width now doesn't necessarily, we wouldn't want the knee width a little bit wider in his racing chair. So Eric, interestingly enough, when he's in his racing chair, is a 10-inch knee width, and it fits him very close. Okay, wheel size briefly. 700C wheels are by and large what's used. Typically 26-inch wheels will get used for a very young athlete. Or some female racers as well will use a 26-inch size. But any athlete that has the ability to use the 700s typically does use the 700s. Push rim size is measured from outside to outside of the metal push rim, which we can, I don't think that's actually called, oh, it is. So here you go. So measuring a push rim, you're measuring outside to outside, the full diameter of the push rim. Typically push rim sizes, I don't know if that was covered in a previous session or not, but we see a lot of 14s and a lot of 15s. Not everybody uses one as big as Daniel's, but there are some, some 13s. So we get requests for 13, 13.5, but there's a lot of 14, 14.5, and 15-inch push rims. I would say if someone's starting out for the very first time, you could probably start them out at a 14 or a 15, and that would be a good middle of the road place to begin with a racing chair and a push rim size. The last definition is the cutout axle. So occasionally you're measuring an athlete that, let's see if I got a good image of that. Yes, I do. Occasionally you're measuring an athlete that has a lot of soft tissue in their legs or a lot of tone. And in some cases you get them in a kneeling position, and because of how much leg mass they have, it's kind of pushing them out of the top of the chair. And so what you can do is you can order a cutout axle. This is offered by all manufacturers. You can order a cutout axle where an additional cross member is added and the rear axle itself is cut out, hence the name, and you're allowed to provide more room directly between the wheels for an athlete's lower legs to sit lower in the chair and allow them to sit more in the chair as well. So that's an overview of all those pieces. Eric, I think I'm going to ask you to go ahead and get your chair. And Daniel, Krieg, anything you guys would add to that? Or Kim, any immediate questions there, or something we skipped over a little too quickly? Nope, looks good. Okay, we'll get Eric into his chair and we'll start going over a couple of measurements. So I first had the chance to measure Eric when he came down to Florida for a, you can hold back?
Yeah,
for an aluminum OSR. And we were able to do a pretty good job, and then Eric came back and was able to get a limiter NRG as well. Take your time. We're gonna do it.
New chair.
And then,
Go ahead, Kim.
sorry, Paul, once Eric is in there, can you go ahead and come onto live video off of screen share?
Yes, of course. Thank you.
Would you like me to move a little closer?
There.
Great.
How's that?
Thank you.
First face forwards.
Okay.
Directly forwards. I'll back up a little bit. Okay. So basically, starting right off at the top, when it comes to the, we talked through the upper frame with the lower frame, and now let's talk through a little bit of that in application. And so in general, when you're fitting someone for a racing chair for the first time, as I said, one of the best ways is to have a racing chair present that the athlete can both physically get into and move themselves. They don't have to perform incredibly well. Sometimes I'll ask an athlete that wants to get measured, I say, well, go ahead and bring your current chair. And they'll say, oh, I don't like anything about my current chair. And I say, it doesn't matter. Bring it anyhow. Because even the width between the fenders, if that's all that it helps us with, is valuable information. And so for Eric, this is a 13-inch upper frame width. And again, that was the distance between the fenders directly above the rear axle, right? So directly above the rear axle, Eric's fenders are measuring 13 inches. And when he gets into this chair, I can basically start taking my hand, and if Eric leans forward in a pushing position, I'm going to start bringing my hand in to basically start to evaluate, and why don't you cross this arm in front of you? Oh, I'm going to basically start putting my hand and start to evaluate that gap right there. You know, can I fit my full hand in there as far as the gap between him and the edge of the chair? By and large, if a racing chair doesn't fit you well, it will negatively impact your performance. I think everyone wants to see, number one, participant of athletes, but as an athlete's goals grow, that upper frame width and the lower frame width, fitting them snugly is important because it allows you to bring the wheels in as far in and underneath the shoulders as possible, which is where you are at your strongest as far as the push goes. No one wants to be pushing out super wide because you just don't get the same technique or power that you need when a chair fits you tight. How tight, you might ask, is good? Well, Eric is at a good healthy snug fit where when he drops in, it almost makes a sound like shoop. It's a close fit. But I do know several athletes that they kind of have to get in one hip at a time in order to really settle down into their chair. And in general, yes, fitting tight in your racing chair is desirable, but I will throw the plug in there as a paralyzed athlete by myself, is that always check your skin. If you're trying a different setup, if you're trying a new chair, whatever, check your skin often, because it doesn't matter how good of an athlete you are, any kind of skin breakdown can knock you out of the game for months at a time. So as far as upper frame width then, basically, Eric, it's very difficult for me to even fit my fingers in. So I feel like I've got a pretty good fit with him at 13 inches. And his rear seat width in the back is a 15. And similarly, what I'll do is I'll get behind the athlete, go ahead and turn close side. Typically, I'll get behind the athlete, and in a similar way, I'll be looking for what's the gap and how much is his body up against the side panels. Again, I don't want too much space because I don't want him to be moving around freely in the chair, but I also don't want to make it so tight that it's a problem over time. So in general, you're looking for a good snug fit, and the best advice I can give someone on acquiring the perfect upper frame width and lower frame width is time, patience, trying different chairs, trying different widths, and then approaching the right width for you over time. An athlete may have plans to lose a little bit of weight. That may be something to bear in mind as well. Eric, go ahead and face forward again. We'll look at that knee width. So we're measuring we'll do knee width next. So Eric's knee width, as you remember, Eric's knee width was, when he was just sitting, was around 8.5 inches. Well, now once Eric is all, I'll move the camera down a little bit. Now once Eric is all folded up, his legs basically are, pressing, his lower leg is pressing his upper leg and kind of expanding him a little bit in the width. So Eric's knee width is at 10 inches right now, and I really wouldn't even try to bring that in any closer. There's barely any room there on either side, so you got a good snug fit. In general, like we were speaking about earlier, the only mistake you can make here, once again, is that the athlete doesn't fit in the racing chair. That's the number one thing that we're trying to avoid. So as fun as it is to play that measurement super close, the reality is that you can add a little bit of foam on the side over time. It's a lot easier to add a little bit of foam to a knee width than it is to find out that you don't fit and then try to cut metal or modify something. You don't want to have to do that. So as far as upper frame width and knee width, that's where we ended up with Eric. The rear seat height and the knee height for Eric is, and I guess we'll go ahead and turn you sideways, Eric. So Eric's knee height is 18 inches in the front, and that 18 inches is measured again from the horizontal portion of the U cross member to the floor. In this case, Eric is right at 18 inches. In the rear, Eric's rear seat height, he's got discs on, so it's a little bit hard to see here. I guess if you turn it a little bit further. I'm able to measure from the ground to the top of the seat rail, just in front of those uprights that we talked about earlier. And Eric is at 17. Now, if Eric was saying, hey, I feel like I'm gonna fall out frontwards, I feel like I just feel very, very unstable, and I finish my stroke way too far forward, I can't seem to get back up, those may be indications that we need to raise his knee height a little bit. And you can experiment with that very easily with the use of some foam. Also, if Eric says, hey, I feel very crowded, I feel like my knees are kind of crowding me, that I don't really get as far forward. Some individuals, like me, if you got some soft tissue in front, you may be feeling like, hey, I can't get as far forward as I want to, and I'm not reaching the bottom of the push rim. And that's really one of the key things you want to bear in mind as well here. So Eric, go ahead and get forward in your pushing position, and go ahead and simulate your push all the way around. So as much as possible, you're trying to make sure that the athlete has good access to the front portion of the push rim for making a strong push downward. And then if possible, every athlete is different, but if possible, for high performance, you want to make sure that they're reaching as much of the ring as possible, and they're able to make a strong extension at the bottom of the ring and then a flick at the very end for good push mechanics. And so if someone was saying, hey, I feel like my knees are stopping me too high, I'm not able to get down and into my push, that may be a scenario where you want to lower the knee width just by a bit in the direction you want to experiment with in order to get more of a complete push. And so that is the knee height and rear seat height of Eric's current setup. Eric's current setup is an axle position of 7 inches. And so as you recall, axle position is, again, from the center of the rear axle to the front of the rear upright. And so Eric is at 7 inches right now. As we talked about earlier, I think I've seen this range most commonly between 6 and 7.5 inches for a given athlete. I think that that's a measurement that at times people are scared to measure, but in reality, I feel like as long as the athlete is able to physically maneuver their chair, in general, you want to provide them with enough axle position. As the number, maybe I didn't explain this well enough earlier, when the number increases, when your axle position increases, the larger it is, the further rearward your body can sit in the chair. So the larger the number, the more tippy. The lesser the number, the more that it pushes you forward and the less tippy the chair is. And so with Eric, we were able to try him in his previous chair. We found that 7 inches was going to be really close. And we knew that we might want him to be able to experience a little bit larger, being able to get his body a little bit further rearward and getting more of the push ring. But we decided that we wanted him to achieve that by adjusting his back upholstery rather than welding the chair with any more axle position. So those are really the basics of the setup that we chose for Eric, and that's an overview of the fundamental dimensions that help us arrive at an optimized cage size that works for him. I will say that in my experience, this is for program managers and athletes, be as patient as you can. You know, the perfect chair setup for any individual, you kind of have where you start and then your perfect setup. And typically through a course of iterations, you kind of figure out over time what the best setup is for you and your body. And it's important to realize that even the most elite athletes have at least one idea of something they'd like to experiment with or try on their next cage. And so stay patient with it, but hopefully with a few of these guidelines, you'll be able to help a few more athletes get involved in the sport and have a positive experience. And that's what I have to say about U-cage dimensions. So I think I will, Krieger, Kim, anything you'd add?
Was trying to unmute myself. There we go. Paul, this has been great because I've never measured anybody for a chair, so it's interesting to hear some of the different factors. We've always relied on people like Adam or Krieger to help out with that. So it's neat to hear the different factors. I was wondering, a couple of things that came to my mind here. So if I have a 9-year-old girl that I am trying to, or a youth of whatever. And they got this great CAF grant or whatever. They got a grant and they are wanting to order a chair, but they know they're going to grow. How much room do you typically see people, and Krieger, you may also have some input here too, adding in for growth?
That's a good question. I've got an answer. I can go first unless you want to go first, Krieger.
No, you go ahead.
All right. All right. So I would say this may vary. I know I mentioned it. I know I mentioned it earlier, but I feel like when it comes to the amount for growth, because of the pushing mechanics, if you try to build the width of the chair too large, it'll impede their ability to push. And so if I was going to measure a young athlete with the intention of leaving them room for growth, I would only probably do 1 inch to 1.5 inches oversized on the upper frame width and the lower frame width at a max. I feel like if I started to get into the range of, I don't know how you feel, but if I started to get into the range of 2 inches larger than they need, even 1.5 inches, maybe pushing it a little bit as far as their ability to push and propel the chair well. So that's the first thing that jumps to mind, is just the athlete growing in terms of width. And in terms of the height or the axle position, I feel like I'd probably try to vary even less than that. So the width is the first one I end up thinking about. What would you add to that, Krieger?
You know, if the width for a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old is say 9 inches or so, you know, if you are an adult, I've been at my best 10.5 inches, which is 1.5 inches more than a 9-year-old girl. So I will almost minimize that, you know, definitely not more than 1 inch. Because I cannot see a 9-year-old in 3 years' time grow more than 1 inch in width. Okay, it can happen, but in general, I think it's push it to maybe too far if you go up to 1.5 inches, maybe even less. You know, 3/4 of an inch is also good, I think.
Gotcha. That's good. What do you for a youth? Do you also keep the length at that 70? Do you shorten for any sort of a youth, or?
So in general, the other dimensions that you may want to keep in mind for a much smaller youth, it's common for us to see requests of a 70-inch wheelbase or a 68-inch wheelbase. And then it comes to the fundamental questions of, okay, well, they're that young. Should they kneel or should they sit? And I would be remiss if I didn't, I remember Teresa Skinner and a couple other coaches telling me time and again, they're like, start them out the way they need to go. You know, start them out right off the bat, getting them used to the kneeling position, so that they're familiar with that, so that they're comfortable. And so I think if you're dealing with somebody that small, that sounds like a prime case where you may want to consider 26-inch wheels and either a 70-inch overall length or a 68 overall length. But typically not anything smaller than a 68. And where you'd see that manifest for the athlete, or where it would start to affect them, really in a way, on an athlete that small, we're not really worried about their performance necessarily on the difference of a wheelbase, right? We're just trying to make sure they have a positive experience, that they're doing great, they're able to build and grow. I would say that functionally, what you want to bear in mind with an overall wheelbase is that it's going to help determine where your steering is. And so, you know, you don't want something super long because it's really hard to reach, but I would say even, you know, an average 9-year-old has pretty long arms. Once you get them a racing chair, I remember measuring a few athletes that size and being surprised that they could reach the steering on a 72-inch wheelbase, 72-inch overall length, just fine. So I would say in general on that young athlete, I think like Krieger was talking about, on the width, overall length of 70 and a 26-inch size wheel is probably a good place to begin.
Yeah, if you think of a 700C wheel and say an inch wider chair, that you know, you would measure say 9 inches, and then okay, let's take an inch wider and 700C wheels. Your arms is going to be pushing further out, but also it has to reach further down, so that, you know, making that decision to make it a 650 wheel is wise.
Yeah, some athletes have the super long arms like Daniel would have when he was younger, but then you see the exact opposite end of the spectrum with little, you know, with short arms, and they have trouble, especially if that cage is too wide, right? Reaching down without rubbing all the time. So great. Okay, those are some good points for people there. I've seen, and just for new program directors who might not have had a chance to go to meets and see the different adaptations. I know Daniel's youth coaches, and I'm sure others, use PVC pipe to build little extenders on the steering handle, oftentimes for athletes who can't reach the steering. So Daniel couldn't reach the steering. Actually, he started out on a haul that was way too big for him. He was in the same chair from the time he was 7 till like 14. And we just used a lot of padding, but he had the long arms that he could, you know, it didn't matter that the chair was too wide because his arms still reached, but he couldn't reach the steering at first. It was a good way to learn how to hip the chair around anything you needed to go around. Go ahead, Krieger.
Kim, I have a question. Okay, so I think, you know, since the beginning of this, we've had so many times we've seen Daniel pop in and out of his chair, but, you know, I blink or I look away for a second, and then he's in his chair or he's out of his chair. Do we have time maybe for Eric to show us how we get in and out of it? Because that's one thing I don't think we really covered with Daniel being so quick.
Yes.
That would be great. And Paul can maybe just, you know, give us some roadside information as you show us.
Okay. You comfortable with that, Eric?
What, jumping out into my chair?
I think they're at basically the basics of getting out and getting into your chair. Right?
Yeah, sure.
So the basic, you know, I think, I think we got time to do it, so that's fine. Unless we have other questions about measurements, Kim, we'll go for the transfers. I thought of this earlier, and I was going to point out that in observation, I've seen a number of different techniques when it comes to getting in and out of your chair. I know somebody like Brent Lakatos, who is a close friend of mine, that he'll back up to a wall, lift his racing chair up completely vertical, drop his legs in, and then basically fall forward into his chair. Then you got more of a side transfer, and so I think that Eric is probably a great case to see the basics of how he controls things. And so Eric, I'll grab your chair, and I guess we'll start with the way out.
This chair is pretty new, so the space between my seat and where my feet slide through I'm kind of stiff in it still yet. So my old chair is definitely a lot faster because it's kind of worked that space in there. But so bear with me crawling in and out of this for a second.
On this side of
Eric, do you use shoes or?
I don't. Well, usually I don't. Like when I race triathlon, I wear these like really fast slip-on things that fly off. So I usually, when I'm going, and luckily for me, when I'm transferring out of my hand cycle and going into my racing wheelchair, it just worked out that these slip-ons always just get stuck on my back. So I just jump up into my chair to get into this, and my shoes always just stay into my bike. So it works out perfect. And then I'm usually being barefooted, my feet just slide right into there pretty quick. I have socks on today, and they're kind of sticking to my padding a little bit. And but yeah, I'm usually barefooted in my racing chair. And my races aren't as long as Daniel's, definitely, where I'm not doing that kind of distance.
So right off the bat, you saw that familiar to everyone that's tried getting in and out of a racing wheelchair. So the very first thing Eric is doing is he's basically loosening up the strap on his back upholstery. So he loosens that up, lifts himself up. He's basically sitting on the side of his fender a little bit. Transfers out about like that. So I guess if I was to summarize that in steps, it would be that he's loosening his straps, he's lifting up on his fenders to push his hips up and above the fenders, He's just gently setting on one side as he positions and gets ready to kind of like turn and drop into his chair. And then on the way in, basically.
You want me to go back over to this side kind of so they can see a little
Correct.
better?
Yeah, I guess probably so. Yeah, we'll turn it a little bit more this way.
All right.
And I'll let you kind of talk us through it, Eric.
Yeah, for me, like I said, this is a little of a newer chair, so I usually just come at it from a kind of an angle like so, and then I usually just put both legs kind of on top of each other, but one staggered. The lower leg staggered a little closer to this fender well, so that when I flip my weight over, it's gonna land in the right spot. So I'm not sitting on my legs kind of crossed a little bit, yeah. So, which I've had happen before and couldn't figure out why I was so uncomfortable or spastic during a race, and then I got done and realized that I was putting an extreme amount of pressure on one leg, and I was like, wow, how did I even fit in there like that? But, yeah, I just make sure my toes are gonna clear the bars back there, and then I always kind of, for me, I never get my butt back far enough, so I always kind of gotta make sure my butt's back far enough, and it's good to go.
So it looks like you spend a good bit of time just positioning your feet, right?
Yeah, in this chair I do, just because it's still pretty new. My other chair, the seat is so worn in that they go in very fast. Like that's my old racing chair that I still use for a training chair on the roller. And I'm in that, I've been in and out of it so much. I noticed I'm breaking this one in and it's getting a little faster.
But I think it's good for us to see, and for the folks watching to know how important it is to position your feet really well first before you try to enter your body into the frame.
Yeah, I've gotten toes hung up before back there and not known, and had one toe kind of stuck on one of the bars in the back, and like once again I was getting spasms and was like, what's going on back there? And then realized how I wasn't watching where my feet were. So yeah, I would definitely tell people to really be mindful of their feet and leg position before transferring on, especially a kneeler, especially if they're going to be on a kneeler.
And at the beginning of getting a new chair, until you really get your system down, is potentially having somebody else check. If you can't feel your feet, and you certainly can't see them very easily right now, is to have somebody else check so that you don't end up with a pressure sore, as Paul was saying, you know, that's going to put you out of commission for a while, and pad all those areas that you're seeing redness after, especially with a new chair, really be doing those skin checks. We actually have a question about that. I use a U-cage, and the top of my tibia bones area get red. Is that typical? So up at the top of your knees, guys?
A little bit, although monitor that carefully.
I can add some details to that. So specifically, monitor the shape that your foam is in at the front of your kneeling pans. If there are rivets or whatever those attachments are called up near the top of the kneeling pan, you can, if those wear through the foam, combined with your tibia, you can get some nice pressure sores or abrasions there as well. I think the first time Daniel won New York City, I was looking at,
I think Chicago,
he was
maybe
all happy doing whatever, but
what you also can do is, you know, I'm an amputee, so I don't have particular problem, but what tells me is kind of logical is move back a little bit. So you spread, for extra foam as well, but to move back a little bit to spread the weight on your shin a little bit more evenly.
Yeah, or put an extra piece of foam there. Daniel will oftentimes just cut an extra piece and stick it under there. Yeah, because you can put yourself out of commission for a good while with that bone rubbing there.
With that mentioned, Kim, I know I've noticed some of the paras have, they have spasms, and I do know, Eric, you have that issue as well, right? How do you handle that?
I get pretty good spasms, and when I first, Paul first measured me for a chair, I was on a foot plate I was borrowing, and I believe it was a V cage that I was borrowing that had a foot plate on it, and then he had me, but it could go into the kneeling configuration, and he had me stay in it, and I just assumed because of my spasms, I made the assumption that I couldn't get in a kneeler, and he was like, well, let's try it, and he had me try it for about 30 minutes, just around here, and I was like, yeah, it's actually not that bad. And for some reason, when I'm in this position, I don't really get spasms, but I do if I'm causing harm to myself. Like I noticed I've had the problem in my old one that I started wearing my cushion too far, my padding too far down, and then I was putting too much pressure on my legs, and I noticed the right one wanting to spasm in the middle of a workout. And I was like, man, I must be having a problem. And I got out and noticed I'd kind of worn the foam down pretty good, and that was getting redness in the shin bone, like the one guy was talking about, and the spasms were kind of letting me know. And luckily, my hip spasms really haven't caused me to be able to not be in this kind of in a U cage. So I'm pretty fortunate in that.
I think that just the last thing I might add for that athlete that says they got some redness there is that each one of the manufacturers obviously has their supply of foam, and you can order more foam from a manufacturer. But just as a quick at-home fix, you can yoga mat is pretty thin and pretty resilient stuff. And so if you just want to try something thin, you need to just try different foam just to see if it'll help relieve some of that redness as well. That's a quick thing to try and check. And
great. What about if you guys? I'm thinking. We talked a lot about a para athlete. What if you got a single amputee or a double amputee? Like what sorts of considerations for the seating there?
That's a good question. As far as the double amputee goes, I think each manufacturer has kind of a version of their U cage that's a bit more customized for a double amp and provides more of a flat seating surface, just taking into account that there's not going to be the knees. I just had one this past week of a double amputee that was requesting a chest plate for some additional help in controlling their pushing mechanics. So for a double amputee, that's not uncommon. For a single amputee, I guess it really depends on that on the leg that's amputated, whether or not it's below the knee, above the knee, etc. Definitely measured a single leg below the knee amputee that I was able to measure for a regular U cage without really any extra considerations. However, I've also measured some single leg amputees where they're quite high, they're above the knee on the one side. And it actually ended up for that athlete that it was much more comfortable and effective by having that leg out front on a footrest rather than the kneeling setup. And the results were winning. So it can be done. It can be done either way. I think for a single leg amputee, you don't necessarily have to be in the kneeling position to compete very well. Anything you'd add to that, Krieger?
No, I think you're right on there.
I know a single leg, and Krieger, I think you know him as well. He's really high single leg, and I think he puts like a big block of foam in his racing chair and is on a foot plate as well. So yeah, just to kind of balance it out.
Makes sense.
Right. Okay, great. Well, thank you guys. Thank you, Paul and Eric, so much for going through these basics. It's always kind of a stressful thing from from what I've heard. Like I said, we've always had the advantage of having some expert measurers help us out. So it is great to have this run through here. So what Paul ran through is the different measures using a top end chair. So we want to just put the different information here. So it's up on your screen right now. From the three main manufacturers within the U.S. As far as their contact information, you know, Daniel's a top end athlete and everything. So we've always been showing top end chairs a lot just because that's what we have. You know, obviously there are plenty of manufacturers out here that are all putting out quality chairs, and so we wanted to give you guys the contact information. And I believe that all of the manufacturers, including Top End, are going to be giving some guidelines as far as the measuring forms and that kind of stuff. So that will be coming in the follow-up email as well. Plus you have the contact information here. So check out your choices and options there. And I just wanted to say for those of you who have been with us through this whole time, this was session 9, and thank you for tuning in. Kriga, thank you so much for being the voice of experience and wisdom here. I know that for when Daniel and I had talked about doing this kind of a session, we wanted somebody who would tell us when we were saying something stupid. So we're glad to have that backup, and just hoping to be able to see people soon at races. This is the time, use this time well to learn about your equipment, and just build that anticipation even more for when we can all see each other again at competitions.
Thanks, Kim. I lost internet for a second there, but we would like to thank everyone for joining us on this session, and especially to our panelists for sharing their knowledge and expertise, and Paul and Eric for being our guests today. It was awesome to have you guys, and we certainly couldn't run these sessions without you. We invite everyone who watched to complete the survey that should be in the chat function and let us know how we did. And also, we will be sending out a follow-up email with the link for that survey, as well as some other useful information related to today's session. We invite you also to check out other events we have on our website's Adapted homepage. And as a reminder, this session has been recorded, and all of our other sessions are up on our YouTube page as well. So once again, we'd like to thank the masterminds behind this series. Thanks Kim, Daniel, and Kriege for guiding this session and finding us amazing speakers for every single week. We are so grateful that we had the opportunity to work with you, and thanks again to everyone for joining, and we hope to see you guys at other virtual events in the future.